The spirit hunter arrived in New Orleans on a stifling night, where the air hung thick and oppressive, as if the atmosphere itself bore the weight of unseen sorrows. The historic cemetery rose before him like an ancient labyrinth, its ornate mausoleums standing as silent sentinels, their weathered crosses, and stone statues seeming to track his every movement with eyes that had witnessed countless souls pass into eternity. The iron gate groaned open with a sound like a dying breath, a mournful wail that seemed to echo from somewhere deep within the earth itself. As he stepped through that threshold, the hunter felt an unmistakable presence, something far more substantial than the mere remains of the departed. This was a place where the veil between worlds had worn dangerously thin, where the boundary separating life from death existed only as a fragile whisper. The silence that greeted him was deceptive, a carefully constructed illusion that masked something far more sinister beneath its surface. Though no living voice disturbed the stillness, he could swear he heard distant murmuring, as though countless mouths were speaking just beneath the soil, their words muffled by layers of earth and time. The flames in his lanterns flickered and danced, despite the complete absence of any breeze, moving as if responding to breaths that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. In that moment, the hunter understood with chilling clarity that in this place, death was not the eternal rest promised by scripture and prayer. Here, death was restless, wakeful, hungry. As he moved deeper between the rows of graves, his boots crunching softly on the gravel paths, he noticed that several tombstones sat slightly askew, their heavy marble slabs displaced as though invisible hands had pushed from below, desperate to claw their way back into the world of the living. The cracked marble emitted an unnatural cold that seemed to seep into his very bones, a chill that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the absence of life itself. With each careful step forward, the hunter felt the weight of unseen eyes upon him, their gaze filled with an ancient hatred that had festered and grown in the darkness. A distant owl's cry pierced the night, but the sound twisted and merged with something deeper, more guttural, a laugh that seemed to bubble up from beneath the earth itself, rough and corroded by centuries of bitterness. The hunter clutched tightly to the protective medallion he wore against his chest, his fingers tracing its familiar contours like a prayer made tangible. But even as he sought comfort in that blessed object, he knew with sinking certainty that symbols and sacred tokens would not be enough against whatever forces were stirring to life within these consecrated grounds. Without warning, the headstones began to tremble, releasing small clouds of ancient dust into the heavy air. The ground itself seemed to shift and settle, as though the cemetery were drawing breath, expanding and contracting with a rhythm that mimicked life. The hunter realized then that the dead who rested here were not truly at peace. They were watching, waiting, existing in a state of perpetual vigilance, needing only the presence of a living soul to awaken them from their restless slumber. A nearby tomb began to open slowly, its stone lid grinding against the base with the sound of a door that had been sealed for far too long. From within that darkness, a pale arm emerged, its skin wrinkled and caked with grave dirt, fingers grasping at the air as though searching desperately for warm flesh to claim. The hunter stumbled backward, but even as he retreated, more graves began to open simultaneously around him, revealing that this awakening was not isolated, but collective, a rising of the dead that had been orchestrated by some terrible unified will. The whispered voices grew louder, swelling into a cacophony of secrets that the dead had carried with them into the earth. They spoke in forgotten tongues, some in archaic French that dated back to the earliest colonial days, others in African dialects that had been buried along with the enslaved people who once spoke them, languages that the living world had long since abandoned and forgotten. The hunter couldn't comprehend every word that reached his ears, but the phrases he did recognize spoke of betrayals that had never been forgiven, of pacts made and broken, of curses that had been woven into bloodlines and carried through generations, sins that had never found redemption or absolution. The spirits began to emerge from their graves, but they did not rise as solid bodies that could be fought or fled from. Instead, they manifested as writhing shadows, twisted and deformed by rage, shapes that defied natural law as they pulled themselves up from the consecrated earth. Some wept tears of blood that left dark stains upon their spectral faces, while others laughed with jaws that opened impossibly wide, as though they sought to swallow the very night itself and consume all light from the world. The hunter tried to raise his silver crucifix, that ancient symbol of protection and faith, but as he lifted his arm, an invisible force pressed down upon him, pushing his hand back toward the ground with strength that no living person could possess. This was not the work of a single vengeful spirit, but rather a legion of the damned, their collective power fed and strengthened by centuries of accumulated fear, anguish, and unresolved fury. They desired more than simply to frighten him, more than to send him fleeing in terror from their domain. They wanted liberation, sought to free themselves from their earthly prison by claiming his living flesh as a vessel, a doorway back into the world they had been forced to leave. Have you ever wondered what makes a soul cling so desperately to this world that even death cannot break its grasp? What pain or rage or longing could be so powerful that it refuses the peace of eternity? The shadows drew closer, gliding across the ground like smoke given terrible purpose, each one carrying within it the weight of a violent end. He could sense their stories, feel the echoes of their final moments. Enslaved people buried in unmarked graves, denied even the dignity of a name carved in stone. Women accused of witchcraft, burned or drowned or buried alive, their screams still reverberating through the centuries. Soldiers who had fallen far from home, left to rot where they fell, never granted the honorable burial they had earned through their sacrifice. All of these sufferings, all of these injustices and cruelties had woven themselves together into a tapestry of vengeance that now turned its full attention upon him. The tombs continued opening in sequence, creating a symphony of grinding stone and splintering wood, until the sound of breaking bones began to echo throughout the entire cemetery. A percussion of death that announced the final rising of New Orleans' most tormented dead, a stone angel statue fractured on its own accord, weeping tears of thick black liquid that ran down its weathered face like ink bleeding from an ancient wound. In that moment of terrible understanding, the hunter realized there would be no easy escape from this place, for this cemetery was far more than consecrated ground or a simple resting place for the departed. It had been constructed atop layers of ancient curses, built deliberately as a prison designed to contain forces that should never have been disturbed. A cage where the boundaries between damnation and salvation had long since dissolved into something unrecognizable. He ran desperately between the mausoleums, his footsteps echoing against marble and stone. But every path he chose, every turn he took in his frantic flight, seemed to bend reality itself, leading him inexorably back to the same location. Before him stood a massive stone sepulchre, its surface covered with symbols he had never encountered in all his years of hunting the supernatural markings that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed from the corner of his eye, as though they possessed a life of their own.